Hi, guys. How are you?
It's good. How you doing, guys?
What's up, gentlemen?
Drells, I
Well-
haven't seen you in a while. I miss you.
I don't like to leave my house anymore, but we I'm sure I'll run into you at some Major League Baseball event sometime soon, Jared.
I look forward to it.
I never like to leave my house. There was never a point where that was something I did. But this is our humble panel. Welcome to Stories from the Pen, what it's like writing in the baseball industry. We're going to keep it casual. This isn't the Sloan Conference. You haven't paid hundreds of dollars to be here, though you are welcome to donate hundreds of dollars. That is, in fact, the point of the panel. But we haven't coordinated a whole lot. No green room where we were planning out our topics here. We're going to wing it. And I think we can all agree on one thing, which is that writing in the baseball industry, things are going great. We've chosen a real growth industry. Our financial futures are assured. So we are here to tell you how you can get in on the gold rush that is a media career in 2024. How you guys feeling?
I've had thoughts in the last few weeks of like, I should just save every penny now and just not spend anything anymore because the demise is inevitable. We don't have to start on such a dour note, but just you mentioning that,
We'll
like, that has gone through my head. And it's terrible because, there are a lot of friends and great people out there. So that sucks.
Yeah.
You have to start a little more positive, I think.
Yes.
It's never been my thing, though. Is it?
I know, but that's why I'm here. I'm here to bring up the energy and to counteract your pessimism about the world and your general ennui about life.
I did suggest we just talk about Star Wars for an hour, but that was shot down. So maybe we could start here. I think we probably individually get this question fairly often. How do you get into this gig if people are still interested in that? I am not one to discourage people from getting into it. And despite how we started to be super doom and gloom and say don't, that is not my advice because I have not taken that advice and I would have a hard time taking this advice. But I think people are always interested in potential ways into this gig, and everyone has a different path, right? So it's really hard to generalize and recommend how to do it, but maybe we can quickly recap how each of us did. Hopefully that'll be helpful to people. So Jared, you want to kick us off?
I'd love to, although my story is pretty boring, I'm afraid, but I'm happy to tell it anyway, because I followed the most cliched, stereotypical path for somebody who wanted to do this. This was all I ever wanted to do. Writing about baseball was my dream of life. Maybe I didn't dream big enough when I was a child, but when I was young, that this is all I ever wanted to do, was to be in and around baseball. And this was sort of my path to do it. So I was pretty dead set on a career in journalism for as long as I remember, honestly. Definitely when I was a child, before even high school, I was like, this is what I want to do. I don't think I knew what the job actually entailed at that point, but I still just thought I wanted to do it. And fortunately, it sort of worked out where, I was a sports editor in my high school paper and then went to college and went to Syracuse, like, 95% of the rest of the baseball writing industry, and became sports editor of the paper there. And through a very fortunate confluence of events, ended up at the Wall Street Journal pretty quickly after I graduated. I graduated college. I had an internship that summer at the Virginian Pilot, where I got to cover baseball actually for the first time. On that internship, they put me on the beat covering the Norfolk AAA club, which was the Baltimore affiliate. It still is. It was actually a pretty interesting team when I was there. They had Jake Arrieta was there. Zach Britton was there. Chris Tillman, who was supposed to be a big deal, was there. Didn't quite pan out. Also, Robert Andino was there, who ended up having a pretty big moment in Orioles, had a big moment for himself a few years later. So that was a really interesting experience. I really believe that having covered the minor leagues was just a formative experience. It's so different in many ways than, when I was put on the Mets beat, 4 or 5 years later. But in some ways I learned more from covering the Norfolk Tides than I did covering the Mets, because it's literally just you in the clubhouse. There's no one else covering the team. You have incredible accountability to all the players. They're all reading every word you're saying in a way that certainly doesn't happen in New York. And it was like a real crash course in like what it's like to be in a clubhouse and be around baseball players and learn to like work a beat. And there's crazy stories of, me getting screamed at by Nolan Reimold in the clubhouse one day, having issues with the manager who is now Bobby Dickerson. I think he's with like the Phillies now or the Padres, somewhere on a big league staff. I don't know, lost track of him. But it was a great experience. And then, I get to the Wall Street Journal, and then a year later, the opportunity to cover the Mets opened up, did that for 3 years, got to cover the Mets, win the pennant in 2015, which was, a really great experience. Then by 2016, I was the national baseball writer, and I did that from 16 through 22 before I transitioned off to the sports reporting job I have now. But yeah, that's my story. It's pretty boring, but it works for me.
Sort of traditional, I guess, if there is such a thing, right? It's still possible to have kind of the conventional way into the industry, I guess.
It worked out for me, and I've been at the Wall Street Journal now for 13 years, and I will stay as long as they would have me. Given the state of media, as long as they have me, might just be till the end of this panel, but I'll take every minute I get.
All right.
My path, not totally dissimilar, not quite as linear. And I don't know how much or how little we can draw on it from it today. When Jared and I are either the same year of high school or a year apart, I think we both had MLB.com internships. When we were coming up, there were things called newspapers still existed. They were starting to crumble, but there were more jobs and there were more people who had been around a long time in these jobs, even though the media was starting to disappear. And so really kind of the qualification then was experience. And so the internships were very important. Having found some opportunity to do the work, to demonstrate that you could do the work, was the key thing. I didn't, it took me a few years to get a beat of my own. And I knew it took me later in life. I was in college when I kind of settled on that is what I want to be as a baseball beat writer. And I remember being frustrated. I couldn't get that job without experience. Well, how do I get the experience unless you let me get the experience? I think it has been the route to a baseball writing job has been democratized. It's been opened up. It is not, you don't have to have covered high school sports and been an agate clerk at the Press and Sun Bulletin of Binghamton, New York, mid-sized Gannett newspaper where they're paying you $8.42 an hour. Wonderful job. Actually, it was a wonderful job. It's now you can come from different angles, which I think is great because it does allow people who deserve opportunities, different voices, different backgrounds. And that was a problem before. If there's one downside is that sometimes some of the traditional reporting skills, it might take people longer to learn them. And there's not as many people above you to teach it anymore. It's a lot of, all right, kids, go out there and do it. We think you got it. And, I think in general, the industry has lost a lot of the tutelage. But yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to be a beat writer. I did the internships. I was at MLB.com. I was a Newsday intern. I did well enough at MLB.com that they hired me as a full-time, part-time job, which meant that I was working full-time, but they were not providing benefits, which was probably, I don't know, maybe a bit illegal. But I was in a state where Massachusetts, so I was young enough I could get health insurance. And it snowballs. And, one got a Red Sox beat job, then I got an Astros beat job, then I got another Red Sox beat job, then I got another Red Sox beat job, then I got fired, then I got the Athletic job. I was on the radio in the middle of it. I was on TV. So I've done a bunch of different things, but it's all been centered on baseball writing. And I think probably what remains true is if you are interested in it, the thing you have to do is find some avenue to do it, whether that is literally on your own, or maybe more ideally, or in conjunction, somebody who's willing to publish you. And of course, the sad thing is that means your labor might often be very poorly, if at all, compensated at the start. And that sucks. And that's something that also needs to be fixed. But the roots were more traditional when we were coming up, which had some drawbacks.
If I think you made an interesting point, at least this, I don't know if you guys agree with this. I feel like people today starting know I agree with what you're saying about the reporting skills. And I think like it's true. There's not as much sort of institutional knowledge. There's fewer editors. There's fewer paths where they learn reporting. But I found that people starting now know 1,000 times more about baseball and sort of how baseball works than I probably do now. And I've been in this, in clubhouses for 15 years. I don't know why that is. Maybe it is what you were saying, Evan, like the way people get into it. There's different skills get you into it. I just feel like there's this incredible knowledge of like how baseball works. Maybe it's because there's so many more like data focused people that are breaking into this. Like when I started covering baseball, I thought I knew baseball, but I actually knew nothing. It turned out I certainly didn't know how like the industry worked in any meaningful way. I mean, now I do a lot like Evan covering baseball labor. I knew nothing about how baseball labor, nothing. I couldn't have told you a single thing about what like the Players Association was when I was starting, basically. I feel like now people like have a lot more knowledge of these things than they did when I was at least starting, or maybe I was just really dumb.
I think that's probably a confluence of a few things. One, post Moneyball, people get interested in things. I think the internet just puts more information at people's fingertips. I think probably a large part of it is like, look, there's been a lot of wonderful sports writers over time, but you had a lot of people staying in those jobs who were just kind of older, dopey people sometimes. You know, it's like it was a job that I think generally sports writers think and look differently today, but then we can tie that to the evolution of the sports industry and media. You know, I think it's a bunch of things. So I think you're generally right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was talking about this on Effectively Wild the other day, that it's intimidating to me just how much knowledge is available now and all the different ways to apply that. Because when I started as sort of sabermetric minded, not that I was ever a true quant, really. I was an English major, but that was the way I approached things through Baseball Prospectus. And I was kind of coming in just as PitchFX was becoming available. And that was just this whole gold mine of information. And then there was a whole generation of people who knew how to mine that information and manipulate all that data. And then a lot of those people got hired by teams, of course, and in some cases are basically running teams at this point. Now it just dwarfs what we had then, even, which seemed like an enormous advance over everything that was available before then. We had StatCast. There are so many ways to break down players these days that I find that you have to have kind of a continuing education just to stay abreast of all of these concepts. And just analyzing a player, for instance, I think we're much more capable of doing it and getting to a insightful answer than we used to when we just had much blunter tools available. But it also means that everything is a deep dive, right? There are just so many stones to turn over and so many things to check and investigate and so many skills you need in order to actually wrangle that data, that even for someone like me, it's just a whole different world than when I started doing this, which is great in a lot of ways and leads to a whole generation of people who sort of speak those stats natively, as opposed to maybe where we're acquiring them as a second language, is kind of the analogy that I was using the other day. But it's an opportunity, but it's also pretty daunting. It makes me sympathize almost with an earlier generation of writers who post Moneyball were just inundated with alphabet soup that now we consider kind of standard. Everyone knows OBP and OPS and WHIP and whatever, right? But coming from what was traditional before to that was just as much of a sea change. And, you know, if you don't grow up with that and you don't start working with those tools at your disposal, then it's really hard to learn how to do that, as is the case with any job, right? Every job evolves and you have to kind of roll with it.
But I think that avalanche of information that is available, that certainly wasn't available when any of us were starting, I think it really speaks to the continued and perhaps increased importance of, you know, creative, original storytelling and reporting. And I say that because, look, there is so much information that is available to anybody, right? And there's a lot of really like literate people when it comes to data, when it comes to sort of how baseball works, how these numbers work, what makes a player good, what makes a team good, what makes a team bad, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many opportunities for people to like do these analyses really smartly. So what separates sort of like what I think what I try to do, what we try to do, it's like, it is that sort of original creative reporting based on our knowledge, but also our access and our ability to like tell real stories that are not necessarily available just by searching databases or by analyzing numbers. I think that's even grown more important. And we've seen these changes before. You know, when I was starting out, people were still writing, you know, game stories every day and there was like this art to writing a good game story. And as time went on, it became clear, like, we don't really need game stories as much as we used to, because everyone watches the game on TV, or they could just like see a box score on their phone in real time, and they don't need like a narrative necessarily of what happened in the game. So that forced, I think, good beat writers to find like other interesting stories to tell, stories that can't necessarily be told just by looking at a box score, or even just be told by someone watching the game on TV. Like, I think that's still going to always be the number one sort of separator. The thing that journalists really need to do to ensure like their own relevance is use the access that they have in a way that makes them valuable, right? Like, that is one thing that the average fan, the reader, still do not have, which is like the ability to be in the clubhouse, the ability to observe in the clubhouse, the ability to like talk to people and tell like real human stories that sometimes like go beyond what you see on TV. And I think the writers that do that best are the ones that sort of are continuing to thrive in this crazy world we're in.
Hopefully something that can't be AI generated either, although I suppose it could be AI fabricated. But you do still have to talk to a person to get a quote, hopefully. Anyway, my background, a little bit different, a little less traditional. Didn't go to J school, didn't cover sports in college, didn't write for the school paper, wrote for the high school sports magazine, I guess. But I initially thought I wanted to work for a team, or at least was interested in that route. I was always interested in being a writer, but not necessarily a baseball writer specifically. I kind of just fell into that. It was a happy accident almost. Obviously loved baseball, but didn't know that I'd be putting those things together. And in college, I started working for Baseball Prospectus just remotely as a research assistant, intern type. I had gotten involved or interested in sabermetrics through BP and Rob Nyer and Fire Joe Morgan, all of the things that were popular then, the Trailblazers, and started contributing there, started writing there, got some team internships, and so was exposed to that side of things. Worked for the Nationals for a little while, worked for the Yankees for a little while when they won the World Series the last time, which was fortuitous timing on my part, though I certainly had nothing to do with it. I was just a bystander, but it was fun to stand by as that was happening. And when that internship ended, I kind of had to figure out what I wanted to do. I realized that any acumen I had with stats or quantitative analysis, maybe that set me apart as a baseball writer, as an English major, but not so much as someone working for a team, because there were absolutely brilliant computer science rocket scientists who I would be competing with in that department, and that would be no contest. And I also, having gotten a little taste of writing for the public and the feedback and the interaction, I just really loved that. And it felt like to be behind the paywall, basically, where no one can read you except your front office, that just seemed a little too confining. And I figured that my skills, such as they were, lent themselves more to the media world, and that I actually enjoyed that more too. So I gravitated toward that, just rose up the ranks at Baseball Prospectus, was eventually the editor-in-chief there, jumped to Grantland. When Grantland ended, I was at 538 for a little while until my contract at ESPN was up, and then The Ringer started, and I've been there ever since. So it's been fairly stable, I guess, by the standards of this industry. And then over time, as we all said, you start to develop side gigs and you do other media stuff that maybe you had no background in initially and possibly no aptitude for initially either, but you figure it out as you go. Started doing podcasts at Baseball Prospectus, still doing that podcast 12 years later, effectively Wild at Fangraphs, and also a bunch of other podcasting and writing at The Ringer, where I've sort of branched out into covering other subjects and also editing. But I think that's a experience that a lot of people have, where either you're doing not just baseball, you're doing other things, or you're doing baseball in many ways, right? You end up writing and talking and being on camera, and you just kind of have to develop those skills or be able to fake them as you go, because none of these things really existed when we started doing this stuff. So you have to figure it out as you go, hopefully. You guys have had the experience of covering teams on a local basis and being beat writers, which I have not had. When I'm in clubhouses, I'm just parachuting in for some specific story or some specific game generally, and not really developing relationships so much based on being with the team day in and day out. I wonder how it's different for you now that you're on more of a national level, where if there's anything you miss about that, whether it was just so grueling that you're relieved that that's largely behind you at this point. But how is that just a different muscle, essentially, than the kind of writing you're doing now?
Structure. The beat writing life, you know what time you're going to be somewhere, and it's kind of, there's very much a rhythm, a cadence to it. And actually, I haven't thought about it in a while, which means maybe I'm finally kind of feeling more comfortable with it. But, when I got to the Athletic, which was my first national role, it was tough because it was, when you're a beat writer, you're doing daily stuff. And then, the Sunday feature for a newspaper, you're doing features sometimes, but you have the dopamine, the sense of satisfaction on a daily basis. And I still feel it to some degree. Like if I go a week, which it's been, without a story, it's like I'm not doing something right here, because the whole reward system, the whole sense of you were doing something right early in my career, for like still the majority of my career, was with much more frequent writing. And I think now, whatever, 4+ years in my time at the Athletic, I'm more comfortable with that, and like kind of accepting that I'm still doing the work, and it'll get there. And but that's tough. The going from kind of daily work to projects. I miss the camaraderie that often, maybe not always, existed in press boxes. There is a social element to seeing people at the ballpark, whether it's other writers, team people. It could be somebody who works in the press box. Thinking of somebody at Fenway. Shout out to Kevo. Just there are people you like seeing. And now I work from home, so I see nobody. It's great. So it's more kind of like, I don't say lifestyle, but it's structural to me. I'm still. It can also be probably a little easier. You have to almost be more proactive about source building when you're not doing the daily ballpark thing. You got to pick up the phone and make a call. You go to the ballpark. Well, you're probably going to talk to somebody because you're in person at the ballpark. So that's my rundown of it, I'd say.
So, like, I thought being on a beat, like I said before, it's a formative experience. I do think that it's generally like a good experience. Obviously, not everyone has done it. Like Ben, you didn't do it. There's plenty of great writers in this industry that never covered a beat. But I do think, by and large, it is a good experience, because for me, it had to do with, like, there's an accountability aspect to being on a beat, like knowing that you're there every single day and you're going to be surrounded by the same people every single day from mid-February until the end of September or later. It really makes you, at least it made me feel very thoughtful about what I was saying, because I'm like, you sort of feel like, all right, you're going to be scrutinized by these people every day. You always have to just show up day after day. And like, you have to maintain this relationship for a season, or in many cases, years and years. And I think that's just a very good lesson in like source building and how you manage relationships and how you sort of work a room. So it was a really valuable experience. When I went off to be the national writer, at first I'm like, this is great, because, players move around in baseball. And it seemed like every clubhouse I went into, there was like somebody I knew, right? I covered the Mets for 3.5 years, and they had 10 billion players, and some of them would pop in for a month and then they'd be traded, or they'd, be cut and sign away. So I'd like go around the league and like, there's someone that I would recognize, but that's changed dramatically. Like now I'm not, I'm not even covering baseball full time anymore. I don't know anybody. And I go into clubhouses and I feel like a complete stranger, which is challenging, especially because I don't have, I'm not on TV. I'm not Ken Rosenthal. I'm not Joel Sherman. These guys that are on TV in the clubhouse every single day, Buster Olney, where the players like recognize their face because they see them on the clubhouse TVs for hours and hours every day. I don't have that. I mean, Evan, you don't have that. Like, so we're kind of going in knowing that people aren't really going to know us, and you hope that you could build a rapport with them quickly. That said, doing the national job for a while, it really, it is freeing in some ways, because you all of a sudden have this huge canvas that you could derive ideas from, draw from to write stories. That's intimidating at times, because you go from like, I have to write about one of these 25 people in this room and this team and what they're doing, to you have to write something interesting about baseball with a capital B. It's like almost like that canvas is so big, like where do you start? It took me some time to sort of figure out where my lane was and like the kind of stories that sort of work for me and for the Wall Street Journal. But as time goes on, I've definitely come to appreciate sort of the quality over quantity approach. Like, I realize when you're a beat writer, you're writing a ton and you do get that dopamine hit of like seeing your name on the website or in the paper every single day. But if you really think about like how good were all of those stories, like now when I'm writing, like the goal is for everything I write to be good, like make an impact. Doesn't mean it always succeed, but there's no sort of stories where it's like, well, I just got to write this to sort of fill space, or I need to write this to sort of, I need to deal with this sort of commodity news that everyone's going to cover. If I'm writing something now that I really think it's interesting and is going to make an impact, which is both exciting and daunting, I would say.
Yeah, the outlet and the audience does change the sort of story you pursue, in addition to your role and how frequently you have to write. And do you have time to do the Roger Angel months after the World Series deep dive, or do you have to do a gamer that comes out before the deadline for your paper on that night? It's obviously a different job. And I found that writing at the different places I've written, at Baseball Prospectus, obviously you have the hardest core, diehard, seamhead sort of audience there, people who have opted in, they're subscribing, right? They want to read the minutia, they want to read the deep dives and the nitty gritty. Whereas if I was at Grantland or if I'm at The Ringer, I wouldn't say I can't write that kind of story. And I've had a lot of latitude when it comes to sometimes just the most niche, nerdy angle that I will still sometimes pursue. But I'm also a little bit more conscious of, is this going to resonate with our audience, people who aren't quite as in deep or might not have the built-in knowledge or the appetite for that, right? Is this something that might resonate on a national level? Could this catch the eye of someone who's coming to our site for some other sport or culture, and maybe they would check this out? So it's not that I ever feel restricted or that there's anything that I can't write, but I guess I do gravitate toward a different sort of story. And I'm sure that that's the case with you guys too. If you're a national baseball writer for the Wall Street Journal and the Wall Street Journal audience, that's maybe going to be a different sort of story or emphasis or angle. And of course, the language, the terminology you use, the stats you feel comfortable dropping without defining them, all of those things are kind of calibrated to some extent by the outlet. I think wherever you are, there's just general acceptance of those things. And as we said earlier, just such deep knowledge of those things among the audience that you don't have to define every stat you're using that's more complex than ERA or batting average. But I think you do have to sort of tailor your tone or your topic choice. So I wonder how you've handled that, especially you, Evan, because you've kind of gravitated toward a different beat on a national level, where you're sort of the sports business guy to some extent, not exclusively, but that's a specialty of yours and something you've sort of owned at times. And I wonder whether that's because you were just interested in that and that was the passion you pursued, or there was a need for that at The Athletic, or you found that you were good at it, or you thought it was a lane that wasn't occupied, because that's always a discussion. Should you specialize or should you try to be good at a bunch of different things, right? And I've tended to try to do the latter, but often the former works out really well and really lucratively.
Yeah, I didn't think about it in terms of like, well, what is going to be better for my career? Maybe I should have. It's a little bit of both. If I look back at my early stuff, like I was covering the AA Binghamton Mets for there was a now defunct thing called Maple Street Press. They did annual magazines for a few teams. It was like a Red Sox one, a Mets one, whatever. And I remember doing a freelance piece for them, probably paid a couple $100. But it was about the front office of the AA Binghamton Mets, right? So I'm a college kid or like late college or just finishing up, and like I'm fascinated by the front office of a AA team. So I can kind of see early roots, and then there's other stuff I did even at MLB.com. I remember doing stuff about player career transition. And then I often credit, and I think it probably is the dominant thing, but maybe I would have gotten here anyway. I go cover the Houston Astros. The Houston Astros in the period I'm there are in their rebuild, and everything is pretty high-minded and built around the collective bargaining agreement of the sport. And so if I'm doing my job as a beat writer, which I really wanted to do well, I've got to be thinking about these larger, off the field business CBA questions, and I've got to start to understand them. And that's it was it was a front office that liked attention, and I learned a lot from them, and it was really an eye-opening thing. And then so I think that's a pretty straight line from there of covering the Astros to, well, I'm really interested in what's going on with labor in baseball, because it was like when Tony Clark would come to spring training, and there were all these questions about how the Astros were doing business. It was kind of a natural progression to league and union issues from the Astros. And the reality for me is, look, I love slider grips. I love all the new stats. They're great. I'm going to leave them to everybody else. I kind of had my time with the on the field stuff. I am personally simply more curious these days about the levers of power, and I love the crazy lawyers involved in the sport, and just kind of the absurd personalities. It just I don't know. And the one thing I actually really like about this, you can learn in any job you're in, but basically in the role I'm in now, it's kind of like, okay, I am interested in this. I don't know anything about this. I will therefore go write about it in such a way that, is hopefully digestible to people, and on the assumption that if I don't know about it, probably, a lot of people don't understand it. And that's the way a lot of the stuff I do go. It's like I remember doing an antitrust exemption explainer a couple of years ago. I didn't know really anything. I didn't know enough about the antitrust exemption, but in learning about it myself, I hope other people were able to learn about it. And so that's really kind of the joy I get these days, is one, just the ridiculous personalities I get to interact with. And two, just like continuing to learn, like, RSN, the regional sports networks falling apart. I didn't know what the hell, first lien holder was before, I don't know, a few weeks ago. I just have to ask these questions in these spaces, and you get to learn from people who are really kind of good at their job. Like, you're talking to lawyers who might get paid $1,000 an hour who are giving you their time. It's interesting. You get to keep learning.
First of all, I can't imagine how formative it must have been to have been covering the Astros during that period, right? Like, Evan, you were really smart, right? Like, you recognized early on, you were smart. I give you credit. You were very smart. You recognized, like, look, the team is, what they were doing at that time, they were talking about, 2012, 13, like the early Luno years. It was like this insane, fascinating experiment. You knew the team was going to be terrible, like beyond terrible. And you knew there was going to be like, no one was going to be watching games or going to games because they were going to be terrible. But yet, like, so what do I do to make this beat like interesting? It's like really understand what's actually going on here. Right. And of course, Evan became like the foremost expert on the Astros, wrote a book about the Astros, was the big whistleblower on the Astros science. Like, Evan's the Astros whisperer, as far as I'm concerned. The Astros probably wish they never met you, but unfortunately for them, they did. And we're all better for it. But I really believe, like, of course, I work for the Wall Street Journal. So I come from a business perspective. And I do write, on-field kind of things. I'm not a sports business writer per se, certainly not exclusively, although when you work at the Wall Street Journal, like, there's an element of sports business sort of comes with what you do. I try to do a mix of like smart on-field stories, smart business stories, but like Evan, I've definitely found myself gravitating toward the off-field stories. And as I've done this longer and sort of see the landscape and see how baseball's covered, I think it's important for people to like understand, especially young people starting in this space. Major League Baseball is very happy to have people writing whatever they want about what's happening on the field and spend gallons and gallons of digital ink on debating rule changes or debating like some blown call by an umpire or Shohei Ohtani's going to the Dodgers or whatever it is. What they don't really like people scrutinizing is the fact that Major League Baseball is a, $20 billion a year business, and having people cover it with the same scrutiny and journalistic rigor that other businesses of its size are covered, right? Like, it's easy to forget that Major League Baseball is this giant corporate behemoth that has its tentacles in literally everything, and to me should be covered as such, no differently than the Wall Street Journal beat writer who's covering Netflix or who's covering Amazon, right? Like, Major League Baseball might not be quite as big as Netflix or Amazon, but you know what I mean. Like, it's a gigantic global company that should be covered, I believe, with that same sort of scrutiny and rigor and sort of attention to detail in their business practices. And that has to do with labor. That has to do with the media situation, the political stuff, the antitrust. They have their hands in everything, and Major League Baseball would be much happier if journalists sort of ignored all of that and focused on what's happening in the field. And that sort of allows, to me, that sort of diminishes what's possible when it comes to covering something like baseball. Like, think of it as an industry, not just as sort of a sport that you enjoy watching on TV.
Yeah, what you were saying, Evan, about just pursuing what really gets you going these days, I mean, that is the most important thing to me. Just following whatever makes me curious, which sometimes takes me pretty far away from baseball or to some weird areas within baseball. It can be either, but I mean, that's what I get out of this. That's why I still love doing this. It's sort of a privileged position to be in, to be able to say, yeah, just write about whatever interests you, because often that's not an option. You have to write about what it's your job to write about, whether it interests you or not. And if you can, though, find a way through luck or skill or industry or whatever it takes into a position where you are able to kind of map out what you're spending your day investigating and writing about, that's the dream, I think, because that will continue to make it interesting for you, because as great as these jobs are, dream job, a lot of people wanted these jobs. You might grow up wanting this job. And then maybe over time, you can get jaded or feel like you're stuck in a rut doing anything that initially sounds like exactly what you wanted to do with your life. So if you're writing about different things from week to week and you're talking to different people and you're learning things, you always feel like you're learning something. You're not just regurgitating something you've already written and something you've already studied. That's great because it keeps you engaged. I think it improves the work. I think readers can sense if you are passionate about this thing. If you're curious about it, then hopefully that's infectious and contagious, and you can convey what makes you so interested about it. And hopefully it'll make your readers interested in it too. So whether that's in baseball or not, if you can find a way to do that, then that's great. And that might mean getting outside of what you know that you are good at and what you've done in the past and becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable from week to week, because you're sort of starting from scratch. Like, a lot of times if I will be covering something, if I'm writing about baseball and maybe something I've written before, I have contacts. I've talked to people for similar stories in the past. I know the state of the literature, right? That I'm not just going to be repeating something someone else has already written 100 times. Whereas if I'm writing about something I've never really written about before, it's exciting, but it's just kind of constant imposter syndrome to some degree. It's like, what do I not even know that I'm missing here, right? And who do I talk to for this? So that is exciting for me. That kind of keeps me engaged, even though in some ways it would be easier not to do that, I guess, and just to find a lane and stay in it, which really works for some people too, and plenty of people do kind of map out, hey, what's something that someone's not doing? I can do that. I can be the expert. I can be the authority on this thing. I'll be the go-to person. And that's great, but hopefully it's something that you also are really interested in, or I don't care how much money you make or how much prominence it brings you. I just don't know that it would bring you the same long-term satisfaction. So if you can figure out a way to do that, then do. But easier said than done. It's hard enough to just keep any kind of job, let alone find your way into the ideal one.
Well, one of the things that's so great about this job, and I mean journalism, but baseball writing too, is like you do get to you become sort of like a mini expert on things that you never imagined you go next. Like you learn so much because you kind of have to, right? Like, this is I spent, for example, right? Like I spent many months in the wake of Tyler Skaggs' death, reporting on that and becoming incredibly well-versed on, fentanyl and the opioid epidemic, something that like I'd only read about in passing, and did so much reporting on and talked to so many people about it that like now I feel like I really know about this topic, or, certain, PEDs, or like you kind of go from thing to thing. And when you really sink your teeth in it, you sort of learn a lot about it. And that knowledge is like really interesting. I don't know if it's useful in the long run, but as someone who enjoys like knowing things and learning things and getting to, I don't know, become like if not an expert, at least well-versed in a lot of different things, this job sort of forces you to do it. Like right now, again, I'm not covering baseball full time. I've been doing a lot of work in the sports gambling space, doing a lot of investigations pertaining to sports betting and sort of impropriety in the sports betting space. I knew zero about gambling 6 months ago. Nothing. Never made a bet in my life. That's still true. Do not understand, did not know how odds worked, know nothing about sports betting. But now I've spent 6 months deep in this world, getting like very knowledgeable about like all of the shadiness in the sports gambling space. And like, I learned something. I mean, it's pretty bad stuff. And I, probably all should be regulated a little bit harder, but that's a conversation for another day.
So we've all had the book writing experience, which is about as divorced as it can be from kind of the daily, day in, day out deadline hitting. Although, again, in your case, Evan, your beat writing or one of your beat writing stops led directly to that expertise and to the book. But since we've all been there, maybe you could share some stories or some perspective on how it differs to work on an extremely long-term, very long-form project like that, as opposed to just the day-to-day, week-to-week kind of quota hitting.
I'm so much happier not writing a book. I don't quite know how else to say it.
But you're happy having written one, I'm sure.
I feel some sort of sense of professional fulfillment, but people, it's a question of how do you work and like knowing yourself, and it can be hard to know yourself until you do it. Some people are very good about, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to do 1,000 words a day for 90 days. And then you're gonna have a 90,000 word book, whatever, spread that out over, 90 out of 120 days. Yeah. That's great. I don't work that way. I'm very much a ADHD, truly diagnosed, tunnel vision person. And it was very hard for me to switch between the day job and the book. And it was also kind of a crazy time with the day job because of the Astros stuff, because of the pandemic, obviously for everybody, and the lockout in baseball was fast approaching. It was just chaos, and it felt like in my life overall. And I needed multiple leaves. I should have taken one bigger one to get the book done. I holed myself up in Morongo Valley, California. Spent too much of my book advance on that, but right near Joshua Tree for a month. This is still during the pandemic, to finally start writing the book. I could see horses from my little cottage window. It was very nice. I recommend Frontier Cafe in Yucca Valley if anybody's ever out there. The Green Dream sandwich is excellent. But it took so much out of me. It was, it was an investigative project more than anything. It's like a business book, investigative book, and it's not like your typical sports book. Not that either of you wrote a typical sports book, because you didn't, but I'm very proud of it. I hope people read it because it was all consuming and stressed me out beyond belief.
I thought it was really challenging. I did not think I was capable of doing it. Like, it was one of those things I thought, like, I'll do it when I grow up, when I get older, when I'm like a real person, like a real adult, then I could write a book. But then I guess I came to realize that I'll never feel like I'm good enough to write a book. So the best way to just do it is just to force yourself to do it. And, if you had asked me 6 months before I started working on the book, if I would ever imagine writing a book on the topic I wrote a book on, I would have said, you're crazy. It never in a million years would have imagined that a story I wrote for the journal, like in 2016, that, something that I just found interesting and thought would make an interesting 1,000-word journal story during spring training would morph into this, 90,000 word book. I never could have imagined it, but I'm really glad that it did. Like, I do agree with Evan that it's definitely, there's sort of like a professional like checklist that if you're a writer, I think you kind of want to accomplish, and writing a book for me was certainly one of them. I think it is for a lot of people. And I still don't really know how I did it. Like, I don't really know what I remember being in spring training the next year after I'd signed the book deal, and I was just starting to really report heavily. And I'm in the Dodgers clubhouse in spring training, and I'm talking to Justin Turner, who was a major character in the book. And I had known him a long time at that point. And he said, so how long is the book? And I said, about 90,000 words. And he said, and how long are your articles for the Wall Street Journal? And I said, like 1,000 words. And he says, so what's the big deal? You just write 90 articles. And I'm like, I guess when you put it that way, maybe it's not that hard after all.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of articles, but also it's so different structurally speaking when you can see the finish line 1,000 words away as opposed to 90,000 words away. It's just a whole different psychological and just how to structure something, right?
Yes. But I had trouble with the narrative, the idea of there needs to be a beginning, middle, and an end. And people are actually going to read this entire thing. So therefore you need to make it interesting, have interesting revelations at the end. I'm so used to being a journalist where it's cram all your best stuff in the first 200 words of your story, and my editor and my agent too are both the biggest challenge I see with journalists who write books is that they put all the good stuff at the beginning and don't understand that you need to save some of it for the end to have some sort of narrative resolution. I'm oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, there is something very satisfying about it. Once it's over, it can be very grueling while it's going on. And I didn't really take any extended leaves while working on mine, which was a mistake. But I think there's still something, yes, it's kind of old fashioned, marker of accomplishment to write a book, right? Which I think probably will increasingly be viewed as less essential or less of a goal. It's not necessarily lucrative. It's not necessarily great on a hours per, dollars per hour basis. But there is still something satisfying about having a physical product that sits on your shelf and you can say, I did that, or it sits on other people's shelves and reminds them that you exist and that they read that thing that you wrote. Also, I think it fosters a kind of connection with readers that's hard to generate when they're reading you for 5-10 minutes at a time, you hope, if you can keep them that long. If you actually engage them in a book length narrative and they're reading it cover to cover and they're spending that many hours with you and your voice, I think it does lead to a kind of connection that is more memorable than the sort of fungible day-to-day, we want every article to be great, but they're not all going to be as memorable as spending hours, days, weeks, months of your life engrossed in a book. And of course, you can go as deep as you want and you can have the definitive take on something, or at least you can aspire to that, which can be satisfying if it works out. We just have a couple minutes left, and I hate to end on a down note. And I don't know that we have enough time to reckon with the challenges facing journalism and sports writing and the media in general, nor do we have solutions. But I wonder if there is anything that you guys cling to. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation online about what can we do to insulate ourselves, to give ourselves some security. And often the frustrating thing is there isn't much you can do because these decisions are happening above your head and aren't even taking into account the quality of your work, which is not to say that you have no agency whatsoever in these situations, or at least it would be nice to think that we did. So what would be your advice, if any, or what optimism are you personally holding on to when it comes to the challenges facing an industry and wanting to continue to do this job that we've all found very satisfying?
This is not, I don't know if this is as optimistic an answer, but I think it's a practical and functional answer. I don't know about either of the two of you, but I have had the experience of being fired for still reasons I don't quite understand. And it was massively devastating for me at the time, as this can be for anybody in any industry. But the thing that I kind of came away from it with was a reorganized sense of self and kind of my relationship to the work. And I don't know what I can tell someone who says, this is all I want to do. What's difficult is how often we define ourselves through the work we do. I have just kind of like in general interactions, I find myself a little less interested in what people are paid to do and more interested in just like, well, who are you? And like, what are you about? And obviously a job can be a part of that. And I think I don't know how to fix it. If I knew how to, obviously I shouldn't be in this job if I knew how to fix it. But I think that is the important thing to kind of keep perspective on. If you love the writing and you're not able to do the writing where you want to at the moment, I got to believe there's some way to find a way to kind of scratch that itch. But look, I have friends who were fired, last year and still haven't found a job. They keep talking about going to other ones. And I don't think there is a good piece of advice I can give them, except to make sure that, you kind of find the self-worth elsewhere and don't let the erratic decision making, because it's not it's not you don't have a job because you're not good. I got fired in February of 2019, and then within that same calendar year broke the Astros cheating story. Right? I mean, you want that doesn't make any sense. So it's just the Justin Turners of the world, take it 1,000 word story at a time, control what you can control. The greatest thing I've learned through my baseball writing career is that these stupid cliches are 100% right. It's the only thing you can do is these little mental ticks that we just ignore, but they're right. That's all, you can't control it. And so otherwise you'll drive yourself crazy and make yourself feel terrible. And I'm concerned about that. That's where my mind goes. Don't make yourself feel terrible.
Well, I'll say something that gives me optimism, some optimism, cautious optimism. And that's the appetite for journalism remains insatiable among readers. And the business model is completely screwed up and no one has quite figured out how to monetize it. And there's all these problems, and there are huge problems. And I don't know the answer. Like Evan said, if I knew the answer of how to fix them, I would be fixing them and not doing this job. But I know, and we all have experienced it, the interest in this work, and people consuming what we produce is high. It is very high. People genuinely care about these stories. They read our stories. They read mine. They read yours. They read all of ours. And I think as long as there's people that want to consume what journalists are doing, someone at some point in some distant future, hopefully not too distant, will figure out a way to make it a more sustainable business model than it is now. Maybe that's naive of me to say, but I remain hopeful because I know that people actually they read our stuff, and hopefully one day we'll all make money to write it.